So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Novel and Change. We're looking at Akin Narayan's novel, The Guide. So the following two sessions will be the concluding sessions for this novel. We will look at how the novel is also corresponding to some of the interesting social, political changes happening in India at that point in time. Because the whole point of a course like this is to look at the relationship between the text and the context. Now, we are looking at Faiza Afzal Khan's essay on cultural imperialism and the Indian English novel, specifically on Akin Narayan. And the whole point of taking a look at this essay is to look at how there's different kinds of cultural capitalism at play, different kinds of cultural identity formations, identity iterations at play, and how the novel, The Guide, is a very interesting, complex calibration of this entire new identity ecology in early 20th century India. And when I say identity ecology, I mean the entire economy of new formed identities, different professional identities, social identities, intimate identities, which are taking place at this point of time. Now, if you remember, the last bit where we stopped is the relationship of the sort of the transition that Raju has in a novel from being someone who's a mercenary, someone who is an opportunist in this new ecology of identities, to someone who is forced to transform. And of course, we don't quite know whether he really transforms or not. In that, the novel is magnificently open-ended. And the open-endedness is, of course, part of the novel's narrative legacy. Now, in this section, we'll talk about the final phase of the novel, and again, how that corresponds to newly emerging India at that point of time. Because also remember, and this was a novel written when Narayan was in the US in a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. And this is also a novel where the perception about India in the West should also be factored in, because there's a new India, which is a rising economy, an emerging economy, but also connected and plugged in to some templates of ancientness, which are also getting reformed in some sense, because the idea of the guru, for example, from being the spiritual seer to someone who is getting increasingly collusive with the capitalist industry, where the guru is also becoming an industry. The guru is also becoming a new kind of commodity identity, a new kind of consumer's identity in this point of time. So, and this should be on the screen now. In the final and crucial phase of the novel, the reader sees how the outer fit becomes an inner one, how the manner turns into the identity, which is why I spent some time talking about identity, how the manners, the performances, they become the identity. So in that sense, the difference between the inner and the outer begin to disappear. What you are at an existential level and what you do at a performative level, they begin to blur. And so the inner identity becomes the performative identity, and vice versa. For while in prison, Raju discovers the mythic life of pastoral pursuits, and this puts him in touch with the earth and with the side of his nature, a very individual, solitary side that he had never known existed. And this is a quotation now. And these are the pastoral bits in the novel, and we may have discussed this before, but it's worth revisiting, because what I want to highlight today is looking at the relationship and how Raju recovers, in a way, essentially the pastoral, almost mythical life of a hermit, paradoxically only in prison. So the prison becomes, I mentioned this already, some kind of a purgatorio for Raju. And when he emerges from the prison, he's a changed man. But to what extent he's changed, we don't quite know, because whether he really becomes spiritual or whether he's just doing one more mimetic act of spirituality is a question that's left unanswered. But this is a quotation. I walked incessantly on a vegetable patch in the backyard of the superintendent's home. I dug the earth and drew water from the well and tended it carefully. I loved every piece of this work. Oh, it seemed to be so good to be alive and feeling all this. The smell of freshly turned earth filled me with the greatest delight. If this was prison life, why didn't more people take to it? I'd been happy to stay in prison permanently, right? So this is a paradox in the novel, that he is actually feeling alive. He's actually feeling more connected to his core existential self only when he is in prison. Now, of course, the prison also is a temporal space, because you only stay in a prison when you're serving a sentence, right? And a sentence is, again, a temporal marker, right? So there's temporality everywhere, and we talked about how the arrival of the railways is a big change in spatial temporality. It changes the sleepy town of Malgudi into something else, which is more episodic in quality, more chronological in quality, more cyclic in quality. And a prison too has a similar structure, because you're only in prison when you serve a sentence. So of course Raju cannot remain in prison permanently, nor can he remain totally cut off from his fellow beings, or the goals of realism would remain unfulfilled. Now, we have spent a lot of intellectual energy already in looking at how there is a sense of mythical realism in the guide, in the sense that how there's myth and realism put together. So there's social realism, which is why this novel is such an important text for us to understand the complex cultural context of early 20th century India. But at the same time, there's also a lot of myth. The vocabulary sometimes is very mythical. It is plucked into the old mythical identities, which are recycled and reused in different contextual conditions. But that mythical socialism, the mythical realism, sorry, is exactly what is happening over here. So there is a sense of temporality which must correspond to the realist novelistic technique. So when he is released, and this is on his screen, when he is released, he seeks shelter in a deserted temple, and there is perceived as some kind of a guru or holy man by the village community, right? So again, he is, we talked about this already, but he's back pleasing others. He's back performing for other people. So we saw how the transition happened from the Railway Raju when he was seen as performing for the tourists coming in. And of course, he performed for Marco, Rose's husband, when he was his travel guide. And then he's back being that in a different capacity. He's performing the role of the guru. He's pleasing others because he's supposed to perform what is expected of him. So once again, Raju finds himself taking on, albeit reluctantly, a role assigned to him by others, and in so doing becomes, as before, a projection of what people need. So it's a need-based identity, and this is important because I just want to spend a little bit of time over here, because what we see here is how even the ancient template of the Guru, the ancient identity of the Guru, is now so heavily plucked into the contemporary identity, which is need-based in quality, right? So everything becomes purchasable, everything becomes need-based in the sense that if there's a need in the market, you have to fulfill it, you have to sort of perform and support it and satisfy it, right? And the whole idea of market satisfaction or customer satisfaction becomes important, because you can see how the vocabulary of the new modern market is being connected to the identity of the ancient spiritual seer, and those two become very problematically proximate with each other. And this problematic proximity of oppositional categories is exactly what the novel does, and I think very successfully. There is, however, a marked difference in the situation this time around. Now at last, Raju's own will matches his receptivity to others' suggestions. His decision to play the role required of him by others, by society, becomes now a matter of individual choice. So there is that subtle difference over here that Raju also wants to align himself to the role of that person who is satisfying others' will or others' expectations by performing the spiritual magical trick of bringing the rains in this particular case. Thus, the inner pattern and outer events flow together. And this is Walsh, Richard Walsh, and the book on Narayana. And it's interesting how there's a pattern over here, the inner pattern as in the existential core spiritual self and the market-oriented, more purchasable, performative self. They begin to acquire mappable patterns, similar patterns, comparable patterns. So when the village people force him to fast as an appeal to the gods for an end to a drought, Raju's initial resistance gives way to a supportive resolve. So initially he's cynical about it. Initially he doesn't know what to do, how to respond, but then eventually he supports them with a resolution. And this is a quotation that is there in page 212 of the guide. If by avoiding food I should help the trees bloom and the grass grow, why not do it thoroughly? For the first time in his life, he was making an earnest effort. For the first time, he was learning the thrill of full application, outside money and love, right? So this is an important thing over here, outside money and love, because there's this selfish need, bodily, visceral, financial, but he's now operating at something outside of that immediate selfish need, which is what makes it a little bit different at the end. But again, the question remains unanswered. To what extent is this need, is this performance over here genuine? To what extent is it authentic? To what extent is it really spiritual? Or is it just another trick that he's trying to pull off? For the first time, towards the end of his life, Raju does succeed in achieving a measure of self-awareness and authenticity. Right, so a measure, the operative word over here is measure, a measure of self-awareness and authenticity, and we don't quite know is it a full measure, if it's a full measure, or maybe it's just some kind of a performative mimetic measure. He finally achieves wholeness by striking a balance between individuality and social responsibility. At the end of the novel, then, Raju is both an individual alienated from the crowd and yet also a character who is constituted, not simply influenced by the expectations of others. So there is this interesting intersection of individuality and social performance, or social conformity, right? And that intersection becomes quite interesting at the end of the novel, because he's quite confused at some level, because he doesn't quite know whether he should do it, but then he signs up for it in a very performative way. But the final line of the novel, as we may have discussed already, where he says to Velan that he can feel it, the rain coming up his legs, right? And then he collapses, he gives in. We don't quite know even what that means. Does he die at the end, or does he just pass out, or does he just fall to the ground? We don't have a neat answer. And this irresolution at the end of Guide is exactly what makes it so fascinating and so authentic in terms of representing a very, very complex cultural condition, where the relationship between good and bad, between authentic and inauthentic, is just getting more and more porous in quality, because it's a very market-oriented economy at this point in time, where everything is consumerist, everything is capitalized, almost everything can enter the market through the market or mediated by the market. So there, the ontological differences, the functional differences become quite blurred in quality. So when he stands at the very end, up to his knees in water, he is utterly isolated from the crowd. Yet it is his collaboration, in some sense, with the expectations that produces their sense of a miracle. Now, the miracle, of course, is something outside of rationality, outside of logic. But at the same time, the miracle is something which is to be consumed over here collectively, right? So he's someone who's a miracle maker, and he's supposed to perform the role of the miracle maker. Now, again, I have to remind you here that this is also the time and age, and there's this cultural momentum at this point of time, where the miracle maker is someone who is quite close to the capitalist industry, right? Where the difference between the spirituals here and the hardcore capitalist is not quite very, very remote, not very far away. So the miracle maker can very much be part of the engine of the market, the financial engine of the market, which produces identities uniquely. The suggestion at the conclusion that rain may be on its way, again, the word maybe is, the phrase maybe is interesting here, is again symbolic of the divine mythic intervention in the realist mode, right? Raju's transformation is in fact achieved through mythic and mystical means, the godlike heroism of a holy man that seems to have the approval of the gods of life. This goal of realism, achievement of balance, sincerity, and maturity by the protagonist, is achieved within the mode of the Indian mythic and mystical tradition. The idea that the holy man achieving a miracle for his people, right? So again, what is interesting here is to look at the mimetic quality of the whole episode, where Raju is very much plucked into the vocabulary of the mythical template, the spiritual template, the ancient Indian template, but at the same time, the mimetic bit is never quite lost sight of, in the sense that what he does in the end is also a mimetic act. What he does in the end is also a performative act. And of course, you're aware that Narayan never really gave an answer, any authorial answer, an authoritative authorial answer as a resolution to this conundrum. When he was asked by reporters, when he was asked by critics what he thought happens in the end, he just said, I don't know. And this authorial distancing is really quite commendable in my reading, because he just makes the character so lifelike. He just makes the character so ambivalent and so complex in quality. It becomes a properly round character rather than a flat character, because he gave an answer. If he offered some kind of a neat resolution, that would have given the novel a sense of closure. That would also given the character a sense of closure, which would really undercut the enigma that the character of Raju continues to have even in modern times. The picaresque character who apparently becomes a saint or simulates saintliness or sainthood rather. And the simulation of sainthood is important because then that continues or retains the picaresque tradition, where the difference between the authentic and the mimetic are not quite resolved, right? So what we see in this particular essay, it's a really interesting essay by Faiz Afzal Khan, where Narayan's writing in general, and there are references to other books in Narayan as well, seems to really be plucked into or really see a very authentic reflection of the complex cultural time that India was going through at that point, because this is an India which is newly emerging through newfound forms of sort of market-oriented identities, where the jobs are opening up, the market is getting more liberalized, and that in a very interesting way, or psychologically also, is undercutting and going against some of the earlier conservative templates of identity, templates of family, templates of kinship, right? And kinship, of course, is a very important factor in Narayan's writing, where he establishes new forms or newfound forms of kinship, which are more closely corresponding to the the new forms of identity markers in a newly emerging India. So what we see in Narayan's writing is a really interesting juxtaposition, almost like a metaphysical conceit of ancient India and a newly orienting India, where the market-oriented identities, the more capitalist-oriented identities, the more democratization that is happening at this point in time really creates a sense of newness, which is not quite entirely removed from the ancientness, but at the same time it gives a new color, a new flavor, a new sort of coordinate to it, as it were. Now, what we will do from this point, before you wind up reading Narayan's guide, as you can see I'm scrolling down towards the end of this particular essay, is look at Narayan's writing through a different prism and different ways in which he can be compared to other writers around that time. Because if we talk about Narayan as someone who's anticipating someone like Salman Rushdie, we find that in Rushdie's writing what we call the famous example of chutnification, where everything gets mixed in a sort of inseparable way. If Rushdie chutnifies identity, if Rushdie chutnifies history, what we see in Narayan is the sort of anticipation of that chutnification, the anticipation of that contamination of identities, the contamination of different forms of identity iterations. Now, when I use the word contamination, I don't use it necessarily in a negative light. What it also means is the idea of purity, the idea of authenticity, the idea of genuineness, it really gets replaced by different possibilities of identity iterations, possibilities which are also possibilities of precarity. Because in Narayan's guide, for example, if you just look at this novel, the difference between possibility and precarity is never quite clear. And what is a productive, positive possibility can also become a site of precarity. Because if you look at the novel, there are many instances where Raju, the character of Raju, he does things which are risky in quality, and it's a risk-taking identity, it's a risk-taking ecology, it's a risk-taking economy, and it's a newly emerging economy which has got a lot of appetite for risks. And its appetite for risks is important because that also offers you opportunities of growth, opportunities of elevation. But there's also the possibility of decadence and degeneration. So here is a character, and here is a cultural condition where the difference between growth, elevation, development, improvement is never quite far away from possibilities of pitfall, right, or possibilities of degeneration and decadence and even death. Because what happens to Raju at the end of the novel is he loses all his money, he goes to jail, and he comes out of the jail, and then we don't quite know whether he's going to live or not, because the last image of him very infantilized image, baby-like. He's falling down on his knees, can't stand anymore. So that infantilization can also be seen as some kind of a image of death, an image of the ultimate fall into death. But then again, we're not quite sure, because there's also the possibility that he's just maybe fainting or passing out, or maybe just collapsing out of fatigue. So that complexity, that cognitive complexity, is really interesting, and that gives you a very interesting picture of the way in which the market, the economy, the politics, the value ecology were all changing in India at that point of time, where the conservative values were still around, traditional values are still around, values of kinship, intimacy, domesticity, duty. But then again, we were having a great amount of contamination that was happening with exposure to different forms, where even ancient Indian heritage, ancient Indian relics, they were looked at from a different lens. If you look at the character of Marco, for instance, we discussed how even the name Marco is interesting, because it alludes to the original traveler from Europe, the original traveler, the earliest traveler, really, one of the earliest travelers from the European world to this part of the planet, Marco Polo, really, where the whole idea of exoticizing the East, which is politically very problematic, but at the same time, it was part of a knowledge system at one point of time. It still is. So that gets recycled in the character of Marco over here, because he's very anglicized. He's wearing the perfect classical European traveler's attire. And the sartorial code is important, because he wants to pass up and perform the role of the explorer, in the same way as Raju is performing several roles at different points of time. So he's performing the role of the railway guide, the tourist guide. He's also becoming the manager of a celebrity at one point of time. And of course, in the end, where there's indication that he's transformed, changed, and he's about to do something for the greater good of the community, that too is very heavily plucked into the performative vocabulary, because there's an audience which comes to consume his act. He stands knee deep in water, and he's praying to the gods to bring the rain. So it just becomes a very public performance of sorts. So we see different kinds of mythical realism, social realism, cultural realism, all mixing in different ways. Now, the ending of this essay is interesting, because it talks about how Rushdie and Narayan can be compared with each other, because I see how Narayan seems to almost inadvertently anticipate the contamination and chetnification of identities that Rushdie talks about. But it's also the nostalgic quality Narayan has. It's also looking back at the past, looking back at the myth as some kind of repository that one can still be plugged into. And this is what appears on your screen now. So, ideologically speaking, Narayan stands in sharpest contrast to Rushdie. The latter can see no possibility for a whole identity in a culturally and politically fragmented world, and conveys his belief through fiction in which all genres cancel each other out, and where even myth debunks itself. In Narayan's fiction, on the other hand, not only do different genres and modes, but myth and realism, comedy and tragedy hold their own, but for the most part, they interfuse with, rather than diffuse, each other. And myth, far from debunking itself, often reigns supreme. So there is this nostalgia about myth that Narayan retains. So despite the fact that there is this problematic proximity between different kinds of genres, different kinds of entities, there's also a sense of a nostalgia for ancient India, where even the possibility that there is an original identity which may be recovered, an original self which may be recovered, is articulated. When it comes to Rushdie, then that desire, that nostalgia disappears, really. There's no need to articulate it. Rather, it is celebrated. That contamination is celebrated. So Narayan doesn't offer us some kind of a seamless celebration. Rather, his emotions are quite mixed. The writing is quite mixed in that emotional way, because there is obviously the sense of a very slow as well as quickly changing India. The value systems are changing, the kinship systems are changing, but at the same time, there's also a constant looking back at the past. So there is this interesting, interfusion rather than diffusion, as it points out. Now, what that means is this creates a possibility in the shipping screen. This creates a possibility of a whole existence for the fiction as well as the characters. But of course, this wholeness is made possible only if present reality is diluted and made more palatable by the comforting presence of an enduring indigenous past. As my discussion of Narayan's last few novels has shown, even for Narayan, this is not always possible. However, as Hashcharan Ahluwalia sees it, Narayan, for the most part, has got along prosperously with one little spot called Malgudi, to the almost complete exclusion of any concern with socio-political forces at work in the country. In other words, Narayan, in most of his oeuvre, chooses to deal with the present only on his own terms, and these include ignoring whatever is unpleasant in the past and current socio-political history of India. So it's an interesting take, really. Not that we need to completely agree with it, but what this also means is that there's a degree of romanticization happening in Narayan, a degree of reified representation happening in Narayan. And what I mean by reified representation is it gives you an imagined space-time, a chronotop, if you will, of Malgudi. And the choice of space-time is important. The choice of that particular site is important because it is a kind of a terra temporality, sort of time-space continuum, which allows Narayan to fictionalize the past as well as the present, right? So while it is absolutely certain there's a really interesting social representation in the guide, for instance, in the sense of how it represents different kinds of identities, different kinds of opening up of different identities which are impossible to imagine earlier. But at the same time, what that also means is that there is the possibility of protecting those identities in conjunction with the mythical past, in conjunction with the recreation of the past, right? Because the very fact that there are so many mythical allusions, the very fact that there are so many references and sort of throwbacks to ancient myths means that there's a nostalgia about the past. And in that sense, Malgudi is very much like an imagined chronotop, an imagined space-time. Now, you find that happening in other novelists as well. If you look at novels of Thomas Hardy, we find similar chronotops at play. So there's a lot of social realism in Thomas Hardy's novels, but at the same time, there is this nostalgic reimagining of an earlier England where the contamination with the current, with the contemporary conditions is not quite that bad, not quite that much in scale, right? But Narayan, it is that. It's both some kind of a chronotop as well as some kind of a protective strategy, a romantic strategy, if you will, to put these mythical bits, the nostalgic bits, together with the contemporary capitalist, market-oriented bits. And what we see in the guide, for example, is an example of how the idea of the seer, the idea of the spiritual self, is retained to a large extent. The vocabulary in the end is a combination of both the ancient and the modern, but at the same time, it is not really some kind of a easy celebration of newness or an easy celebration of contemporaneity. There is this resistance towards complete change, resistance towards absolute abandoning of earlier traditions, which is why, even though it's mimetic, there's an effort that Raju gives in the end to go back in time, to find back his touch with the pastoral and use that as some kind of a template or toolkit with which he may, at least mimetically, perform spirituality, perform ancientness, perform the whole idea of the sort of spiritual seer, right? So there is that interesting tension as well as collaboration in Narayan's writing. So with that, we end this particular session. We'll have one more session where we talk about how, in a macro way, Narayan's writings in general and the guide in particular, really, it really anticipates, it not just represents what is happening at that time in early 20th century, which is something we discussed already, but the last bit that I want to spend some time in is how it seems to anticipate some of the current conditions of India and global South, as it were, in terms of how different forms of spirituality, different forms of messianic, mystical identities are very interestingly proximate to contemporary capitalist, consumerist ecology. And this correspondence is important because what Narayan seems to show in the guide as well as elsewhere in his writings, and how there is both the ancient and the modern, ancient and the new, and they all come together for different reasons. There is a sort of instrumentalization of the past, instrumentalization, nostalgia, but at the same time, that instrumentalization is not really innocuous all the time. It's also oriented towards a certain kind of future imagination, right? And that's something we'll talk about in the final session on the guide, which is basically a discussion on how Narayan's writing is a really interesting representation of 20th century India, early 20th century India, but also in anticipation of the India that is now, India that is today, right? So with that, we end this session, and I look forward to seeing you at the subsequent session. Thank you for your attention.